So thank you for joining us today for the session, When Will Digital Deliver on Its Promise, of the conference Embracing a Movement for Change. It's organised by the Transforming Construction Network Plus, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have this afternoon. So I'm Jennifer Whyte. I'm a professor at Imperial College London, and I wear a number of hats. I'm a centre director, I'm a chair in systems integration, and I'm on Construction Leadership Council. But most importantly for this event, I'm a co-investigator on the Transforming Construction Network Plus. So in a moment, I'll introduce you to our distinguished panel. But before I do, just a few points of housekeeping and context for this session to help you interact with us. First, today's session is being recorded. The recording of the webinar with the slides will be shared by email after the event and will be accessible on our website in a few days. Second, we invite you to share your questions using the Q&A option and to add comments in chat. If you wish to ask a question to the panel, or if you have any technical issues and need support, please use the Q&A option that appears at the bottom of your screen. Please note that you can choose to ask your questions anonymously or not. You may send these questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them in the Q&A session at the end. If you have any comments as we're going through, so not questions but just comments, then please use the chat function on your screen. Please don't use the chat for asking questions. I will be monitoring the Q&A and representing the questions to the panel. So finally, we're also live tweeting the event using the hashtag TCN+. So feel free to share your thoughts and views on Twitter. To briefly introduce the Transforming Construction Network Plus. The network mobilises a movement in the construction community, bringing together experts from a range of disciplines to tackle the most pressing problems across the digital, energy, construction and manufacturing space. The network, importantly, unites academic researchers with industry and policy through networking and skill building events, creating a community and a body of knowledge to inform future construction policy and practice. It also provided funding for research projects through 2 funding calls and is one of the investments of the Transforming Construction Challenge, the UK government's challenge to the construction sector and the research communities to make buildings more affordable, efficient, safer and healthier. The Transforming Construction Network Plus is a joint project between the Bartlett, UCL's Faculty of the Built Environment, the Centre of Systems Engineering and Innovation that I lead at Imperial College London, and Warwick Manufacturing Group at the University of Warwick. There's a lot of people behind the scenes today, and I send my thanks to them and also the research team, and I'll talk about their work in a moment. So the overarching question for this session is, when will digital deliver on its promise? And I just want to say a few words and then I'll introduce the distinguished panel. So there's been a lot of calls for transformation over the years, and we talked about it this morning and people brought up the questions around digital, and I hope we can go a bit deeper in the session today. You know, it's perhaps only now that digital tools are becoming available and capable of delivering the necessary tight inter-organisational collaboration and the digital handoffs necessary to link construction and manufacturing in the way that the industry is set up at the moment. So computing power has grown exponentially over the last 5 years. Now everything's digital. We're using a digital medium now to collaborate. While we're not used to accommodating exponential rather than linear changes, through the move to remote working, we've learned how quickly practices can change. So I think there's some really interesting questions about digitization and digitalization, and I hope we get into some of them today Yeah, in the 2020 Best Paper in Project Management Journal, which was on how digital information is transforming project delivery, I flag how pervasive effects come from characteristics of digital data, how it's shareable, accessible, remotely searchable and updatable, transforming project delivery models as well as a firm's business models. Sorry, I've got a phone call, but I'm just going to ignore it and carry on. So apologies if you can hear ringing in the background. And it shows you some of the challenges, I think, of working in this mode. So as a scholar of digital practices informed by work on social construction of technology, I would say we shouldn't see digital as separate from practices of delivery. There's an evolution, and to some extent a co-evolution of technology and practice. Although global tools can be fixed and shape our local practices in various ways, and our practices can be institutionalized through things like procurement in ways that make it hard to benefit from the technology. Within the Transforming Construction Network Plus, we've had a team of researchers, so looking at research on business models, working with some of the leading practices, so ACOM, Brydenwood, MACE, and there's an interest in our work around platforms. On the one hand, product or component platforms, and on the other, digital or data platforms, as a way to use digital technologies to gain efficiencies by reusing components across projects. The Transforming Construction Network Plus has written a digest on platforms and hosted a constructive conversation to try and clarify our language around closed, semi-open and open platforms used in firms, supply chains and ecosystems. And I know Annabelle on the panel will help us in our thinking on this. So given the distinguished panel we have and our fabulous audience, I expect that we'll have a great conversation about the future direction and the latest technologies that are informing practice, what we can learn from other sectors and from leading practice in the US. And I'm very pleased that we're joined today by two panelists from the US, and how this connects to agendas on the digital twin. So I'll just say a few words about our distinguished panel, and then I'll hand over to them to give Chimay Anumba, a giant of the field, who's helped shape my own and many others' thinking on digital delivery. He'll give us insights on future directions. Professor Annabelle Gawer, who is the internationally leading thinker on platforms and firms' platform strategies, who will help put the conversation we have on digital in construction into a wider context of digital and product platforms. Jon Antevy, who is a co-founder of the software company eBuilding and has been leading development on software and tools for many years, bringing a wealth of experience working with clients and projects to transform delivery in the US, and now also as part of the global software company Trimble. And Mark Enzer, who's leading work on the digital twin for the Centre of Digital Built Britain, and is a key connection between leading practice as CTO for Mott MacDonald and this part of the Construction Innovation Hub, which is tasked with the delivery of the digital information framework to transform construction. So I hope you'll agree we've got a fantastic panel lined up for you. And I'm now going to hand over to Professor Chimay Anumba to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here, even if it's only in digital form. The theme of the session, when will digital deliver on its promise, actually presupposes that there is a promise and that we all know what that promise is. With so many different participants at this conference, I would suggest that we probably have more notions of what that promise is than the number of participants. From my perspective, digital is delivering and will continue to do so in the future. We've come a very long way from the sketchpad system in 1965 to the sophisticated, what I would call BIM plus models of today. As a PhD student in the late 80s, one of my tasks was to undertake a technical review of the data structure of AutoCAD 2, which was so basic that it had no associativity between dimension lines and the dimensions of the drawing. When you compare that with the functionality of current building modeling tools, such as Revit, we can very clearly see that digital is delivering. As has already been mentioned by Jennifer, digital delivery does take place within the context of the co-evolution of technologies and the deployment environment, in our case, the construction industry. And with this co-evolution, the key questions are, one, should we be developing systems that mimic manual processes? And that is what I would call mechanizing the horse. Or should we be adapting business processes to leverage the power of emerging technologies? So the adoption of more collaborative approaches to construction delivery and innovative construction technologies have actually made the industry much better placed to leverage the opportunities and benefits of technologies. And so as this co-evolution takes place, occasionally we do get a number of disruptions, such as the current pandemic, which I will allude to a little later on. And so there's a constant evolution, both in practice as well as in technologies. And what we need to do is to figure out how best to corral the two and ensure that there is synergy. So at the University of Florida, one of the areas we've been working on has been on going beyond building information modeling to look at cyber-physical systems and digital twins. We are focusing on having this bidirectional coordination between the virtual model and the physical construction, which would have tremendous benefits as you go through the design, construction, all the way to the facilities management. And also we are extending that to looking at digital twins. And with digital twins, we are exploring to what extent you actually want to create a twin of the product or whether you want to develop a twin of the process. And there are situations where you want to do one or the other, or you may actually want to do both. Some of our current work has focused on looking at the operation of mobile cranes on site. And you see the picture in the bottom right corner of the slide, where we're actually trying to track what is happening in real time and providing feedback to the operator. We're also currently looking at digital twinning in healthcare facilities, which have a tremendous amount of technologies and systems. And if we're able to make improvements in that area, then we have tremendous opportunities to improve practice in that area. So we're looking at all of those, and this involves taking advantage of advances in cloud computing, sensing technologies, robotics, and also the Internet of Things. So I'll move on to the next slide. So what we are finding is really that the biggest bang for the buck, as we say here, actually lies in the co-deployment of these technologies in addressing construction issues. However, there are still numerous technical challenges and other aspects that need to be addressed in dealing with this. In the top left slide, what we have is a study we did looking at the integration of what we call smart construction objects with the concept of Internet of Things and cyber-physical systems. And this is basically a deployment framework for how these can be simultaneously leveraged to deliver benefits to project teams on site. And so we are tapping into, we are tapping into the use of robotics as well, in that we do have the use of drones and mobile robots on site that are able to capture a lot of data on the physical site and then transmit those in real time to enable design and construction teams to utilize that to improve the processes. So as we deploy all of these technologies on site, some of the critical issues that need to be looked at include how these interact with the humans on site, as well as in the remote design offices. This has serious implications for safety. There are cybersecurity issues, and there are also workforce development issues that all need to be looked at. The current resurgence of artificial intelligence, which a number of us explored in the early 90s and beyond, provides a tremendous opportunity to actually have a step change in the way we use these technologies and address some of these other challenges. But also, we are working in the context of much broader societal challenges that will influence how we develop new digital technologies, as well as how we deploy them within the industry. Some of these challenges relate to climate change, sustainability, social justice, workforce demographics, as well as pandemics such as we have now. Who would have thought that with the pandemic, the level of IT penetration and digital technology penetration will be as widespread as it is now. Even grandparents are learning how to use Zoom in order to be able to connect with their kids and grandchildren. And we in education have had to learn how to teach things like architecture studios and other practical interactive classes using digital technologies. So I would like to conclude by saying that I think that digital is delivering, but there is still a long way to go. And we do need to work in collaboration with technology developers as well as practitioners to shape the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chimay. So we now hand over to Annabelle.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, for the kind invitation. I want to share with the audience today some results from my research on platforms. And I've been studying platforms for over 20 years. I'm a professor in digital economy at the University of Surrey Business School, and the head of the department in digital economy, entrepreneurship, and innovation, as well as the director of a research center, on the digital economy at the University of Surrey. My angle on platform, and I'm not a specialist of the construction industry, but I've looked at platforms in a variety of industries. My interest really comes from the business strategy of platforms. And so what I would like to suggest is that digitalization has not only offered new techniques and new technologies. So in a way, it has helped companies to create value in a fundamentally different way. And Professor Chimay just mentioned some of these new ways of creating value. But it has also created the opportunity for companies to capture value in a different way. That is, to benefit, to capture value, to profit, to generate profit in a different way. And this has an implication on how digital is really changing competition in some sectors, and how new tech giants are seemingly disrupting competition in established sectors, and how the boundaries between the sectors themselves are undergoing some kind of blurring of boundaries. So, and I'd like to move to the next slide now. Right. So there has been an explosion of companies that call themselves platforms, and we are familiar with the name of, you know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and we could say, okay, so what does it have to do with construction? And I think that I would like you to think about the ways in which some of these companies have entered sector after sector and have changed the dynamics of different sectors. But there's a lot of activity around digital platforms. And if you think about the most valuable companies in the world in terms of market capitalization, they are all platform companies. And if you think about the investment in terms of venture capital, we did some research that showed that between 70 and 80% of all the unicorns, that is companies whose private valuation exceeds $1 billion, are also platforms. So to the next slide now. So going back to the premise about how platforms create value. The word platform was used already in a pre-digital world, in manufacturing, for example, and in that sense it is a product platform. So if you look on the slide on the left-hand side, you have the concept of a product family. So when you have several products that are built reusing core technologies, like a template that can be then customized to create from a similar core technology a variety of different products. On the right hand side of this slide, what you see here is how the concept of manufacturing automotive platforms is used. So what you see here is that the chassis and internal components are the same for sport utility cars or compact multi-purpose car or family hatchback cars, and that the variety comes into plugging in or adding on peripheral modules to what is a core architecture, which here is the platform. So the concept of platform in this sense of manufacturing is to reuse a core while allowing variety and customization on peripheries of the system architecture. And the advantage of using such an approach is that it reduces costs, it increases the rapidity of getting a product to market, and it simplifies the processes of innovation by going back to this core that is being customized. So it allows companies to get the best of both worlds, the benefits from mass production, which has to do with the core that is being replicated, as well as the benefits of customization to tap into demand that is distinct from different types of customers. Moving on to the next slide now. I have looked at platforms in a variety of contexts, and this is in a research policy paper that I published a few years ago, which has been quite influential. I have identified that platforms exist not just within one company. So the example that I gave, you know, of, for example, in a car manufacturing, you could have, you know, the core as well as the modules being developed by the car. So it could be done within a firm, it could be done alongside a supply chain, or it could be done in an ecosystem. And by ecosystem, let me give you an example here. If you think about the iPhone, and if you think about iOS, the operating system of Apple, you will notice on your iPhone that there are hundreds of thousands of apps that are accessible through your iPhone. But these apps are not built by Apple itself, nor are they built by what we commonly call suppliers to Apple. It's a new category of economic agent. We can call them complementors or developers of complementary products. They are not linked to Apple via a buyer-supplier relationships, but the products that they develop are compatible and especially designed to work with the underlying platform, which is here, iOS. So what you have is a new kind of industry structure, which is not a firm, which is not a supply chain, but which is an ecosystem where you have a constellation of economic actors who develop products or services that are especially designed to be complementary to each other. The degree of complementarity doesn't come from heaven. It is designed, it is structured through the design of interfaces that the platform owner designs in a way to make it more or less open. And there are benefits to having it more open. The benefits would be that the platform firm can tap into the innovative power of lots and lots of innovators that the platform firm doesn't have to know ex ante. The disadvantage of having a platform that is too open is that the platform owner could lose control of the platform, and you could have forking of the platform, multiple incompatible solutions that emerge. So that could be one disadvantage of being too open. Another disadvantage of being too open is, again, not keeping control over the behavior of some actors in the ecosystem. So what we see now, for example, in social media with the scandals around Facebook and hate speech and violent content is an example of one particular kind of platform not controlling the behavior of so-called bad actors. So in this slide, what I'm trying to show is that actually the decisions of firms as to the openness of the interfaces is going to have an impact on the pool of innovators that they can tap into. And so we are going from, on the left-hand side, internal platforms governing the actors that are engaging with the platform through managerial authority, so labor contract and managerial fiat. In supply chain, authority exerts itself through contractual relationships. And in industry platform is a more fuzzy way. There's still a lot of research that is trying to understand what exactly do we mean by ecosystem governance. But there is certainly a new way of managing autonomous economic agent. They are autonomous to some degree, but there are also some kind of dependency and interdependency between them and the platform owner. So moving to the next slide. I want to say that what we see in the economic landscape today are fundamentally two different kind of ways to use the concept of platforms. The one that I've talked about until now is what I call innovation platform, where the platform is a technological core or foundation upon which other firms can develop complementary innovation. Another way in which the word platform is being used is really that of an online marketplace where the digital technology facilitates the connection and the identification of buyers and sellers, or people who want to give away, share content, and people who want to consume content. So what you see here is that the platform in a transaction platform, meaning serves as an intermediary for direct exchange or transactions. So here the platform is a broker, if you wish, between different types of customers that could not transact with each other. That is subject to network effects. And network effect basically means the more people on one side of the platform engage with the platform, the more it becomes attractive to people on the other side. And you see an example like that with Google. The more search users go onto Google search to try to answer their queries, the more Google becomes attractive to the other side of that platform, which is going to be the advertisers. What our research shows is that the most powerful companies actually bring together innovation platforms and transaction platforms and create hybrid companies. And examples are Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, etc. So I know that there's a lot that I talked about in a very short time, but I think these are the fundamental principles of how platforms generate value and capture value. I'm happy to engage with questions towards the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle. I think that's given us a lot to think about in terms of platforms and how we use platforms in the sector. I'm going to hand straight over to Jon. If there are questions that you have from the speakers as they're speaking, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end. So Jon, over to you.
Great, Jennifer. Thank you. Good morning, at least morning on our side here. So, you know, just a quick background about myself. I grew up surrounded by developers and builders. You know, growing up, my grandfather and uncle were general contractors. My uncle still is. And while my parents developed small multifamily warehouse units and apartments and the like. So I grew up in and around construction sites and loved the energy and excitement of seeing daily progress of new construction. And it was only natural, of course, that I pursued my passion at the University of Florida, undergrad in architecture, bachelor's of design, and then master's in construction management. That's how Chimay and I got to know each other, as well as the others that were on my thesis committee. So, you know, as you can imagine, in 1995, so it's been about 25 years, I co-founded eBuilder. And I very much asked the same question posed by today's conference, which is, you know, when will digital deliver on its promise? So, you know, when you think of that question, right? You know, effectively, construction is a natural for these types of collaboration platforms. So when you take a look at all the different stakeholders, right? So you've got the owner side, VP design and construction, the program manager, and all the superintendents and field engineers and project managers, and then you layer on the consultants, you layer on top of them the contractors, you know, don't forget permitting, entitlement, and then of course you have the end users, especially if you take healthcare as an example, right? The end users have a lot to vocalize about their projects. So collaboration effectively it's an imperative. So it was clear, of course, in the small projects I grew up in, that once you started to move into the larger projects, you know, then you start to look at that, you know, this approach here where you have losses of information along every step of the way. And you know, the bigger the program, the bigger the potential for loss. One of our largest clients is implementing about $5 billion a year, each year, of new construction, down to the smallest that's maybe doing $1 million or $2 a year. But you could really see the scale as you start to approach those bigger dollars. You know, every percentage point moves the needle quite a bit. So you've all seen these studies over the years. The data very much tells the story. There isn't an owner on the planet that hasn't reported exceeding budget, schedule. Obviously, quality is a component that always gets talked about, and which of these levers are you going to pull at any one point in time? So we commissioned several studies with Dodge Data and Analytics. They're part of, used to be part of McGraw-Hill, the book publisher. And there's really two themes that have stuck out, especially over the last 25 years. And the very first one comes down to leadership. So if you really just look at the first two bars there, so top performing owners in the dark blue versus lower performing owners in the light blue, you can see that the top owners had better and more clearly defined job roles, and they had more clear and consistent communication from their leadership. The only way to affect change management is to have these kinds of numbers behind you and individuals impacting those numbers. I think on top of that is almost the oh, by the way, and even though we're a technology company. So you have to have a standard practice. You know, we always like to say what gets measured gets done. And the use of technology enables these consistent processes. But you have to have that strong leadership behind. We have seen many projects go well, and we have seen many projects go not well. But they're using the same tools. Why is that? It's because the leadership or their ability or inability to impact the change management aspect. You use the carrot or the stick. So it's been an interesting journey. I think it's one of the reasons people say, you know, John, were you afraid that Google or Microsoft or some big company was going to come and dominate the space? And while we always had that in the back of our mind, we always knew that there is a heavy services component to what we do when you're bringing large teams of people together to uncover those rocks in the road, if you will, prior to starting the project and then during the project or projects, i.e. the program. It really makes a difference at the end of the day of looking at this kind of information. So, you know, as I look back on the last 25 years, you know, where we provided these kind of software to large owners, you know, we've certainly documented how digital has delivered on its promise. Again, it's worth noting that the success is very greatly, as I mentioned, depending on the level of change management. So I'll end on a little fun fact. After 25 years, and I'm still at Trimble, finally had a chance to play the role of the owners in the building of my house. So it's the screen that you see in my background here. So I'm having a blast using all the different tools that I professed over the years. And, you know, after a year of design, we've done about a year of design review, and we're about 6 months into construction, have about another year and a half to go. I can certainly attest, you know, Jennifer, to the question that digital certainly has been delivering on its promise, you know, not only for our clients, but for me personally. You know, I'm using SketchUp during the design phase. Interestingly enough, I was using that, you know, not because Trimble owned it, but my architect had it. But certainly I know how to use SketchUp, and it's just been a wonderful tool to be able to walk through the project before it was built. We then couple that with the use of the HoloLens, right, where you know, which was jointly developed by Microsoft, you know, with Trimble, where you could walk through and get a sense of the spaces. We're using Lumion, which is, like, from my understanding, based on a gaming engine, where we could actually render the project itself and walk through it in real time with lifelike views. You know, what we're using as an owner eBuilder to manage all the costs on the project. It's all about forecasting, so we eliminate or minimize surprises. We use Project Site to manage all the field activities on the construction sites, all the RFIs, tons of RFIs, submittals, daily reports. It's just been wonderful to, you know, get that on an iPhone. We're using other tools that are not ours, right? We use Drone Deploy. That's actually the shot you're seeing here is from Drone Deploy to actually survey the progress as we're moving dirt. OxBlue for overall progress of the job site. We'll be using Multivista to actually take photos before we close up the walls. So whole bevy of tools and many stories around. I'll end with just a quick story. Contractor said we want to put the trailer on a certain spot on the site. And they looked on the plans and saw that there were going to be 2 drain fields there. So they had asked the civil engineer, can you go ahead and move that over 10 feet so we can leave the trailer here and not have to move it for the rest of the 2 years? So that was at about 50% design development. When 75% design development came out, we were able to do a comparison in Project Site between the 50 and the 75 to see that it in fact had been moved over the proper amount. And then we were able to layer the drone deploy image or the SketchUp model onto the drone deploy image to actually see that where we're going to put the trailer, in fact, is just south of where that drain field is. So we eliminated a huge potential issue later on of having to then relocate this large trailer that would have had to have been moved. So with that, I will yield my time back over to Mark.
Thanks, John. So Mark, looking forward to your presentation, and then we'll move into panel session.
Thank you very much. So I'm Mark Enzer. I'm the head of the National Digital Twin Programme at the Centre for Digital Built Britain. As I was listening to my fellow panellists and just being fascinated by what they said, I was just trying to pick up the connections between what they've input so far on this subject and what I have to say on the National Digital Twin Programme, and maybe a little bit of the work, the wider work of the Construction Innovation Hub. And I see many different connections. So what I'll try and do as I go through this is maybe just touch on what I see those connections being. So with the National Digital Twin Programme, we see this as putting in place a data infrastructure that will unleash the information economy. As I introduce it briefly in a moment, I think that we potentially can see this as a form of platform in itself. And I do see this theme of platforms very strongly coming through. So what I'd like to do just briefly is introduce the context in which this sits and then show how I think it can be seen as a platform. So I'm just moving on the slide. There we go. So as a bit of context for this, I think it's important that we see the built environment as a system of systems. So this is seeing the economic infrastructure mixing with social infrastructure and the interface with the natural environment, all coming together in the built environment. And the reason for emphasizing this right at the front is that I think that if we see this built environment as a system of systems, then we can see a way forward to unlocking value from that system for the benefit of people. And maybe we can see the built environment itself as a platform for human flourishing. And when we do see the built environment in this way, and we can therefore see the delivery of new assets in the context of the wider system, then I think it's possible to identify how these various different platform views come together. So I mentioned briefly the work of the Construction Innovation Hub, and they've been doing some absolutely brilliant work on a form of platform for the delivery of new assets, particularly in social infrastructure. But this would be a classic platform in the form that Annabelle introduced. A physical platform, a kit of parts that enables a collaborative delivery focusing on hospitals and schools, but obviously applicable more widely, so that a number of different players in the ecosystem can come together and be part of delivering something better and faster. And that clearly has a really important part to play in this bigger picture. But I guess one of the things I would want to put across is that there is a bigger picture, and that the operation and maintenance and use of what we already have is essential. And when we see that bigger picture of the system of systems operating as a platform for human flourishing, we can see the delivery of new assets almost as an intervention on the system. We can see the whole thing. And when we see that whole thing, then we can understand the benefit of applying the concept of a cyber-physical system to it. I think if we don't see the system, then we can't see the cyber-physical system. And it won't be valuable if all we do is focus our attention on the delivery of new assets. We've really got to see the whole thing and consider the cyber-physical system in delivery of new assets and in the operation, maintenance and use of the existing. So I think when we see it this way, we can see the value of the digital assets as well as the physical assets. It's where we bring digital and physical together, then we see something that is smart. This is what releases greater value and greater outcomes for people. So we're not just talking about outputs, the product of delivery, but the outcomes. And so it's really into this context that I think the National Digital Twin makes sense. And what we're talking about with the National Digital Twin is an ecosystem of connected twins. We can see the value of individual digital twins helping to make better decisions in individual parts of the process or individual products, as Chimay introduced at the beginning. What the concept of the National Digital Twin does is see that there is benefit in making connection between those digital twins. The connection we see as being shared data. And so if you boil down the idea to its absolute essence, really the National Digital Twin is all about facilitating secure, resilient data sharing across organizational and sector boundaries. And in order to do that, we need to have consistent approaches for sharing data, rather than everybody setting up their own point-to-point solution, which is always possible, but doing that would build friction into the system. What we see is that we need to have a consistent shared rules for the industry that enable that approach to data sharing. And I guess something which I'd be really interested to explore is whether in that way we can see the National Digital Twin itself as a platform. It would be, I think, a platform based around the shared rules, but enable many players to collaborate in the space because of those shared data rules. And so really, I think that what my fellow panelists have said has kind of sparked me down a route, seeing that potentially this data infrastructure is itself a platform. So I'd like to kind of conclude there by just very briefly reviewing it. We see really useful physical platforms in the delivery of new assets. And I think the work of CIH is pointing in that direction. We can also see the benefit of digital platforms enabling collaboration in delivery. And as Chimay said, you can see the value of digital twins, both for process and product. And then I've tried to overlay on top of that the idea that potentially this ability to share data across sectors opens up the possibility of another form of platform in which you can see many different players collaborating, driving better outcomes for people and society. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. So you've given us a lot to think about. You're sort of drawing the boundaries a little bit broader, perhaps. And so we're going to move into our panel session. And if you haven't shared your question, you can still submit it through the Q&A. And I see that there are some questions coming through. And I'm going to draw on these questions from the audience. But to kick us off, I thought we maybe just go down the panel and ask about this kind of title for the session, if you like. When will digital deliver on its promise? And I think, Jon, you've given us an answer to that. But Chimay, I don't know if you want to reflect on that and the other things that panelists have said quickly, and we'll just go through the panel as an opening to the panel session.
I think, as I said before, I do think it is delivering. It is a continuum. There's not going to be one set date by which we have utopia and everything is delivered, because as digital technologies are evolving, so is society, so is the industry. And so I do certainly think that as new challenges come along, we have to figure out how to leverage the existing and emerging technologies to address those. So digital has delivered, is delivering, and I expect that it will in the future as we grapple with new challenges.
Right. Annabelle, do you want to reflect on that question about digital? Okay, so I'm going to move us on maybe to some of the questions that are coming through on the chat in that case. So there's a question that I want to kind of probe us on a bit. So this morning we had a lot of conversation about the structure of the industry, and Stuart gave us a long history of the way in which it moved to be more and more hollowed out firms with supply chain interactions. And we discussed the sort of move back in the UK towards more direct employment. And I wondered if, picking up on that conversation in the morning, you know, maybe Chimay, this is one for you as well, but I wonder if digital has a role in enabling organisations to have the confidence to employ staff directly. Yeah, and I think we've got some different models of digital going on here around platforms and collaboration, or about direct employment and delivery in that mode. And I wondered if you might reflect on that, Chimay, having sort of been in the UK and in the US.
Certainly it does have a role. One of the critical things, I think, is the extent to which we provide the necessary training and enablers for people to appropriately deploy these technologies. There's certainly a lot that can be said for. I'm a big advocate of appropriate use of technology. And so we do have a lot of imitation of what others are doing as opposed to what is most appropriate for us. And so I think that is very important in targeting and hiring the right people in order to help deliver what is needed in your specific firm. And I think it will probably be good also to have Jon comment on this, because over the years, he's hired a lot of people to deliver digital technologies, working with a variety of client organizations. And he has a lot to say, I think, on making sure I get the right people to do the right things.
Jon, would you like to come in and comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the people. I mean, I may mention to that in my presentation. You know, what does it mean to get the right people? You have to have the right belief system. I remember when I started, I was introduced to another, you know, I guess alumni or folks that were really close to the university at the time, FMI Corporation. They're a management consulting organization of about 100 or 150 so consultants. And early on, they used to do these things called partnering sessions, you know, and just the term partnering session, you know, what does that mean? What's the context? And they used to basically spend a day long with an entire team. And at the time, they were using what's called a DISC profile. There's predictive index, Myers-Briggs, so on and so forth. And they'd go through these exercises to understand different people's personality. And then they would also talk about, you know, here are some typical issues that we've seen on road projects or healthcare projects, whatever the project was that they were doing this partnering session on. And they would talk about these rocks in the road. How are we going to get over these rocks in the road when we come across them? So it's almost like you were playing out these conflicts ahead of time so that everybody knew how to get through it. And then on top of that, we then layered the various tools that could help and assist, you know, in this process. And most of the time it was being able to have quick and easy access to information so that you can make informed decisions. And I will tell you that even in the sales process of talking and trying to sell the technology, at least I could always tell pretty early on until this day if that solution is going to be successful. And what do I mean by that? In the presentation itself and all the questioning on the front end, is leadership truly involved in asking good questions and genuinely concerned in asking the right questions? Versus the leader that comes in and says, yeah, I'm bringing everyone together, you guys figure it out, let me know what you want to do, and then they leave. And those never work out well because you don't have leadership from the top. So I think the human aspect is always going to be a component for what we do. And I think those that don't accommodate that, especially in these larger programs, are going to struggle.
Yeah, I mean, we had a bit of discussion this morning around leadership and also around the role of government. And when Mark was talking, I was really picking up on this idea of the collective good and how information can support the collective good and how you have competition in a sector at the same time. And so I wonder if we can just go to some of the questions on the Q&A. And the first one really is around digital platforms. And in the case of construction, where government is a big construction client, and they're about 60% in terms of a client for the industry in the UK, then who should own the digital platform? Yeah, and maybe Annabelle, maybe you can start us off on this.
Sure. That's a really good question. The question of ownership of digital platforms, and I think it's helpful to distinguish between who owns the technological tools versus who owns the data. And I think that individuals and companies to some extent are legitimately more and more concerned about privacy around their data. And we're all very aware that data can unlock value, but it can also be used in ways that is detrimental. So I think by separating the question of ownership of the tools or the intellectual property associated with the technology with the control of the data, we can perhaps go further. And I think there are new systems that allow users who generate their data to keep more control over their data. I'm also aware of some initiatives, for example, in the space of smart cities and platforms such as hypervision platforms, where you have some solutions that are associated with open source technologies and open source foundation. And I think there is some promise into partnership between these foundations and local governments. So that's the way I think things can move on in a way that combine the private interests that need to be put in place for investment to happen and the legitimate concern for privacy or restraining possible misuse of data.
That's very interesting, Annabelle. And I wonder, Mark, if we could maybe come to you, because you've been working at that kind of city and larger level on this national digital twin, and I know you'll have had conversations about tools and data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to digital twins of specific assets and networks and systems, it kind of makes sense for the people who are running those assets and networks and systems to also run the digital twin. So I think that there's a direct connection there that I guess is obvious. I think that when it comes to the data itself, it's less clear about ownership, and it might be better for us to talk more in terms of curation or stewardship of data on the basis that the data can be used to gain insights which drive these better decisions that can then lead to better interventions that then hopefully lead to better outcomes. So I think the value of the data really is in the outcomes that it leads to. And therefore, I think it's really helpful to see data and the value of data in those terms, rather than in kind of more traditional terms of ownership, because data is just different from other assets and resources. So I think that's one important point to make in this space. And then I guess another one for me is something that you picked up on, Jennifer, which is the whole public good piece. And for these assets, which are kind of ultimately owned by us, they are paid for by taxpayers' money. It might have been our great-grandparents paying taxes, but we've got this amazing system of systems that has been built over many decades, even centuries, that is kind of it's public, and I think that there's a principle, a deeply embedded principle that we should establish, that the data relating to public assets should be used for public good, and that is enshrined in the report that came out from the National Infrastructure Commission. It was called Data for the Public Good, so I think the clue's in the name. And that report recommended that we should move towards having a national digital twin, and that to unlock it, we should have this information management framework. So I think that this whole concept of both public good and value creation are incredibly important in the data sphere, and we should really consider those those 2 points in parallel with each other.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on a couple of the other questions that are coming through in the Q&A on the platform before we kind of move on. So someone is asking, should digital twin owners give away their data to enable the digital platform for human flourishing? Yeah, which I think, Mark, relates to your question. And then there's also this question about the development of different digital platforms, and does the government need to regulate digital platforms in this space? And so maybe if we go first to you, Mark, and then to Annabelle on those two questions around the digital twin and the platform.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an absolutely fascinating question, and I don't have the answer, because I think that we should get the answer by very widespread and engaging conversation. This is something that is both an ethical and a political matter, and we should have a very engaging conversation to get to the answer. I wouldn't even actually try to answer that one just now. Is should we give it away? I think that there are lots of options, because it could be given away, it could be shared, it could go through some kind of transaction process that generates value for somebody. There's all sorts of possibilities. The thing that I would want to come back to, though, is what sits under that layer, because we can only really start talking about giving away that data or sharing it or doing something useful with it if we have created the platform within which that's possible. And I think that if we don't address the shareability of data, in other words, making the data shareable, minimizing the friction in data sharing, then discussion about giving it away or selling it or all that becomes a little bit academic, because we will have made it harder. And so I think it's really important for us to address these 2 points together. One is making the data shareable, which creates this opportunity within which we then have to answer a secondary question, which is, now that we've made the data shareable, how do we want to go about that? And do we want to have some kind of transactional relationship within that? So I think with the National Digital Twin Programme, what we're really focusing on is the underlying one about making the data shareable. And what we want is to see a really good, engaged conversation to answer the second question about what we then do with it and how we make that market exciting and valuable.
So Annabelle, if we can go to you just to kind of expand on that, maybe that question around the government role in platforms.
Right. So when the question says, when the question asks, should the data be given away, what kind of data are we talking about here?
Mark, do you want to answer that?
Yes. So I think we're talking about all sorts of data here. The most easy, I guess, to talk about would just be asset data, asset and systems data. So data relating to the assets, and that I think is easy to talk about because it is very far away from personal data. If we talk about personal data, we talk about humans interacting with the assets, the conversation becomes overlaid with all sorts of other really important things which we have to grapple with. But if we leave that to one side for the moment and kind of go to the end of the spectrum where it's easy to talk about it, it's just data about the assets that enable us to make better decisions so that the assets can deliver more value. I think at that end of the spectrum, we can easily talk about how we release that value for public good. And even at that end of the spectrum, I think that there are questions about how we share the data and whether it should be sold or given freely.
Right.
If I may just very quickly go to the other end, the personal data side, much more complicated.
Right. Right. Okay. That's really helpful. So while I do agree with you, Mark, that these are two different questions, the question of how can we make data shareable versus the value capture of this, if you wish, or the business models around it, or who benefits, or how will people benefit from it. I understand that we can have them as separate conversation, and I hear your view that it should be sequential, just starting by making it possible to be shareable, and then, try to have a debate or society debate. I'm not exactly sure who would be part of that debate, but certainly that it's a much harder question to answer as to who should benefit and under which modalities. I am a little bit doubtful that the first one can really succeed if the second one isn't clarified a little bit further. And it's because that, technological decisions on standards, for example, are always to some extent business decisions. And so the owner of these assets, if what you're talking about is, publicly held assets, and the government has a strong view about how to share that data, then that's fine, because you have, basically one actor, even if, of course, there's heterogeneity of views within government and public, administration of public goods. You can enforce a particular kind of, standardization of protocols about sharing data and have sort of a big experiment about that alone. And that can create a kind of momentum, which I think is worthwhile, certainly. So the decision makers that would have to be involved own assets and privately benefit from them, I think they will have to know in which context they can benefit or other can benefit before they will want to involve themselves into any activity around sharing data.
May I come back on that very briefly? I think I agree with you, Annabelle. I don't think that the questions can be dealt with entirely separately, but I think it is really useful to see them as separate questions.
Sure.
And I think there's something else which we can factor into this, which is just to do with the intrinsic value of having data that is both consistent and of high quality. So what we see as we're digging into what is needed to make the data shareable, what we're finding is that one of the most important things is to drive quality and consistency of data. And that has got some intrinsic value. And so we can easily imagine that those organizations that have got their act together and the data relating to the assets, processes and systems that they have is in good order, and it is consistent and of a determinate quality, which is consistent with the use to which it's put, that will make that organization actually have a higher value. if you compare it to another organization whose data is in a complete mess. And so there's something of intrinsic value of having data which is both of sufficient consistency and quality. And it's that same thing that enables data to be shareable. So I think it's really worth us seeing quality and consistency of data as being something which is important in its own right anyway.
So thanks, Mark. I'm going to move us on a little bit. So I think, the framework that you drew out in terms of the National Digital Twin takes in the whole of maintenance and the life cycle of an asset. And I think that's very useful for us to reflect on, and to reflect on where the boundaries of our industry are. Especially as we start to think harder about relationship with the natural environment. And we've been doing some work at Imperial about how the built environment sort of sits within the natural environment and how that changes the way that we model and think about it. But I want to draw us back to those points of intervention. So the construction sector as an economic sector is very much driven around those points where there's interventions made into the infrastructure system. So whether that be a mega project such as Crossrail or a small intervention, on a domestic building, Construction Leadership Council then thinks about these in 4 pots, right? So civil infrastructure, housing, then the sort of maintenance and upgrades, and then commercial construction and social construction. And so just thinking about those interventions, I'd like to come on to some of the questions that are specifically about that kind of construction phase. And so someone is asking about, given that the construction sector is perhaps fragmented and highly regulated and governed in some countries, if not in the UK, then how do you think the supply chain and industry platforms can be successful? And maybe, Jon, if we can go to you first on this, and then other people can pick up on that.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer. I think it depends on where you sit. When you think about, when you talked about the word life cycle, when I think of healthcare, like a Kaiser Permanente or an HCA Healthcare, they, truly own, Kaiser especially, right? They're just in their whole model as it is, that they're owning the insurance side, the network, the healthcare, the infrastructure. Everything is full circle. So they think about, even if you move it out of the technology for a moment, they're bringing in patients and being very proactive on the front end to get them in for their early visits, knowing that they're going to have a healthier outcome, and they're going to have fewer people coming through their hospital system, since they own all 3 parts of the healthcare system. So we clearly see that model working well. We work with a lot of higher educational facilities in the U.S. And what's interesting is that the construction group has a different leadership than the facilities group. So the construction side is making decisions about inputs into their budget, knowing that even though it's going to have a better outcome for the facilities person long term, but it's going to cost them more money, well, that's coming out of their construction budget, and they'd rather say, you know what, I'm going to spend less money so I can have a beautiful building when I'm done. But now long term, the facilities folks now are going to have a tougher time. It's not going to last as long. So, we see these discussions going on quite a bit, but it's usually only with the largest of owners that we work with that truly talk about the plan, design, procure, construct, and then the close out, and then ending with the operations. So that becomes a huge input, and they talk about the COBE standards with BIM and collecting all that data on the front end. But again, there's very few that are able to get all the right stakeholders in the room to make that happen. But I think that's the key. I think people are asking all the right questions, but you have to get that right leadership to have it all work together as a good ecosystem. If not, sort of the wheels come off at various phases throughout the life cycle.
Chimay, maybe we can go to you and pick up on, there's a question here about subterranean and green infrastructure and work to digitize those. And I wonder if you can kind of fold that into your answer.
Yeah, I know that a lot of work has been going on with regard to subterranean infrastructure. And I think that some of that has actually been led by people in the UK, particularly with the Ordnance Survey. And but there's a lot that's been going on in terms of mapping out the subterranean facilities and all of that, because the number of times that construction work goes through utilities is amazing. But then, of course, there's also a lot of opportunities if you appropriately map these out to have different teams working together. So, for example, you do not have to close a particular street every other 3 months when you can coordinate between the different infrastructure systems to have a period when everybody comes in and does the maintenance. So there's certainly a lot that I know has gone on with subterranean infrastructure. With regard to green, I think that is probably a bit more dispersed. There are lots of different groups that I'm aware of have been working on how to do stuff that we sometimes term as green BIM. How do you incorporate sustainability into BIM? Or how do you capture aspects of sustainability in other systems that can then interface with BIM? But I do know there's a lot of work going on.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's actually some work going on the amount of carbon that's used in digital systems, and in the past we've treated that as though it's free, but increasingly as we start to be modelling at city and national level, we start to have to think about the carbon cost of the data as well as the carbon cost of the very expensive materials like concrete and steel that we use in construction.
Yeah, so one of the areas that we've been very interested in is looking at the resilience of infrastructure systems. Yeah. And you cannot do that effectively without having an appropriate understanding of both the subterranean and above ground facilities and the interdependencies between them. Because that becomes very critical when you dealing with extreme weather events like we have to do in Florida with hurricanes every year. You do need to really understand where are these facilities and how do you protect them. And part of that, a critical part of that is also the communications infrastructure. Because if those go down in emergencies and people are relying on them to communicate with family members, or more importantly, if emergency management and first responders are having to rely on that and that goes down, then that becomes a very difficult situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, one of the challenges perhaps with infrastructure is that people don't notice it until it's not working. You know, and so people fail to recognise the benefits that they're getting from infrastructure day to day. I want to move us on to a question on ownership that's a little bit down the Q&A, and this comes from Graham Winch. And so he's saying the issues of ownership are central here. The ecosystems platforms identified by Annabelle are clearly owned by a profit-making business which sets the rules, you know, perhaps unilaterally. You know, if you look at recent issues around COVID apps and Apple's dispute with Epic, you know, so perhaps there's questions about how that translates to our sector. So who owns the digital twin, or who owns the digital platform that's used in construction? You know, and is it okay for that to be privately owned? You know, clearly private ownership wouldn't be of the built environment level digital twin wouldn't be acceptable. But how could it be done by the public sector? You know, and so maybe Annabelle, if you could kind of give us some reflections on that public to private kind of challenge, if you like, around the use of platforms in this sector.
Well, it's a little bit similar to the question we evoked earlier with Mark, right? So I mean, they're always going to be, in any kind of business ecosystem, they're always going to be divergent incentives, okay? And we have to recognize that. Now, on some public initiatives, and especially if we are thinking about building a new kind of infrastructure, and I think perhaps the digital twin program can be seen as a digital infrastructure, then the government is in a position to make some structuring choices to create some technologies that the public can have access to. So these are fundamentally political choices, right? These are political choices as to who will have access to a set of resources that will benefit from the investment from a variety of parties. You know? There is no technological answer to this. It's a political question, and that will drive the process.
I don't know if any of our other panelists want to pick up on this quickly. Very quickly, Mark.
Yeah, very quickly. So just to pick up on a kind of a high level point, I think when it comes to considering something like the National Digital Twin program, or the National Digital Twin as a platform, and picking up on some of Annabelle's earlier words, you know, the need for the kind of complementarity and the shared rules to enable the kind of compatibility that enable many to come and play, even though there's no kind of transactional relationship. I think that makes it incredibly important to sort out this question of interoperability. If we see that setting that interoperability up really means setting up some rules that enable that interoperability, then those rules need to be open and shared. And so I think that there's a real need for the highest level rules of this thing. And we might call it a top level ontology, but you know, that's starting to get complicated. Let's just keep calling them high level rules. I think it's incredibly important for them not to be proprietary. I think that if the highest level rules become proprietary, then that would close off the potential market. Whereas if what we can do is collaborate on the rules and then compete on the game, then I think we get a really good balance. So that would be my point. The highest level rules must be non-proprietary, must be shared. And in fact, that's the reason why on the National Digital Twin program, we call them the commons. It's something at a high level that we all share.
Yeah, so I mean, there are platforms being developed at different levels here, right? So Construction Innovation Hub is developing a product platform with components for delivering new build. And then there's the work that you're doing on the National Digital Twin. And you know, just thinking about both of those, I think there's maybe a question that I want to ask people in the panel around, can we expect a technology provider to come in and disrupt the industry? So Annabelle, you had lots of examples of platforms which had changed the boundaries of sectors and disrupted other industries. I wonder if you and Jon might respond to this question about can we expect a technology provider to come and disrupt the industry?
I could take a quick stab at that from an artificial intelligence perspective. So it goes back to what Mark and Annabelle were hinting towards. You know, we've struggled. We have, I forget what the latest number is, but you know, trillions of dollars of construction, active in our system over the years, and we have all this data. But back in the day, we didn't have contracts that allowed us to use that data. So we've had to go back to individual clients one by one and say, hey, look, if you opt in, we'll make the data anonymous, so no one's gonna know it's you. but look at all this great data that's going to come out of it. Now, there are common elements, certainly, of our system and other systems, but then there's also high configurability within our system and other systems as well. So now you run into this dilemma that even if everyone says, hey, we're going to opt in, now how do you make sense of this data? And we're seeing a lot, we're certainly doing quite a bit of research. We see others that we talk to doing similar research to figure out how can you truly dump in all this data from not only our system, but other facility management systems, so that whatever is put in, you truly get some output that's intelligent. And I think there's quite a lot of work to be done there, and I think that's where you're going to see some exciting things coming out of it, so that the Kaiser Permanentes of the world can truly start to say, okay, if we design an emergency room with this many beds in this locale, what should that cost be? What is the performance going to look like based on all the other data that is being collected and aggregated and brought up?
Yeah. I mean, I know working with the Alan Turing Institute, the quality of data matters for being able to learn from project to project. So I can see the making sense of data, and if we could use AI and machine learning and so on to better make sense of data, I think there's a big opportunity around that. Annabelle, do you have thoughts on this kind of disruptive technology provider kind of question? I mean, I guess the industry is a sort of a newer context for you, but the things that you've seen in other sectors and.
What we've seen in other sectors is that we had an infrastructure which was the internet, and and there were some principles about everything should be accessible, and if you think about Tim Berners-Lee vision about the World Wide Web. So there were some design principles that allowed a lot of sharing and a lot of value to be created because different people could input a lot of data into the system. But later on, you had private actors that created extra layers on top of that. And, for example, with social media, created social utilities, such as social media platforms, which it turns out was not part of the original vision, but found demand. Right, so there were lots of individuals around the world who've been willing to engage with these extra layers that were built on this public infrastructure. And then what you started to have is a centralization of the process of value capture. Okay, so now you see regulators trying to come on top of that and say, well, we need to re-inject some interoperability into the system. But they're hearing from the dominant platforms, it's incredibly difficult. We can't quite do that. So my own trajectory with regard to platform and the value of sharing these assets has been somewhat tempered in the last couple of years when I've seen the behavior of platforms that have become very dominant. And the reason they've become very dominant is because they were providing an enormous amount of value. And we can't always expect that the government or public institutions are going to be ahead of that curve. So I have now a little more concern than I used to, say, 5, 6, 7 years ago, about what Mark calls the intrinsic value of interoperability, intrinsic value of data being able to seamlessly go from one silo to the next. Whereas I used to think that way, I am now a bit more cautious. I'm a bit more cautious because we've seen a lot of abuse happening, and whereas I am very enthusiastic about the possibility of creating value if everything works well with the technology and the digitalization and the interoperability of a lot of things, I think I am a little more cautious now to see that it doesn't always go well in ways that we can't always anticipate. Yeah.
That's an interesting thought for us, I think, in this sector as we start to move into the use of platforms more extensively.
I just want to say, I certainly don't want to come across as, I don't think the process is a good one. I'm just saying, let's learn from the mistakes. Let's learn from what's happened in other sectors to have a privacy by design approach in order to protect what needs to be protected, and while trying to take advantage of the possibilities of value creation coming from sharing and using data coming from all sorts of different contexts.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm aware that I'm not managing to represent all of the questions that are coming through on chat. I think there's a possibility for panel members to type answers to some of these questions, but I'm going to pick up on one from Kerry Mashford, who's asking, how might digital twins and digitalization, for example, of whole life costs, be used in financing decisions? And she's thinking here about the timing of decisions when significant costs are incurred in the digital pre-work associated with a project before contracts for construction and work on site begins, and also on the assurance associated with construction projects. Chimay, do you want to start us off on this, and then we'll go to others if they have a thought?
Yeah, again, these are very interesting and not so simple questions to answer. But I do think that when you start to do these sorts of models, then you actually have the capacity to look beyond the immediate design or construction to look at life cycle issues. And that is when you start to then look at, okay, what are the trade-offs you need to make at the design stage? And I think Jon alluded to this when he was talking about the front-end procurement unit, not thinking about the life cycle implications of the decisions that they make, because they do want to make the budget now and have little regard for what happens downstream. So I do think that it also ties into some of the work that we did in the 90s, looking at what we called concurrent life cycle design and construction, which was all about getting the team together up front to think the whole project through, not just through the construction, but also through the operation, maintenance, and even eventual deconstruction. And when you have that sort of life cycle perspective, then these decisions can be made pretty much at the front end before anything actually happens on site. One of the beauties of construction is also the fact that up until you actually start digging the first thing, digging on site, pretty much all you are dealing with is information. And so if you have models that can simulate and run what-if scenarios for all of the different possibilities, then you're able to, you're better informed to make those decisions very early on. And we do have a whole series of publications that demonstrate that the later you make some of the critical decisions, the more expensive they become. And then if you don't actually do the right thing, you are going to get into rework and redundant work and all of these other things, which all contribute to the lack of meeting the budget, the sort of cost overruns, time overruns, and the lack of delivery of value to the client. So these technologies will help us to better address those issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think what I've been hearing over the last hour or so has been that really we're talking about aggregating data sets today in a way that in the 90s, if you had a data set for one purpose, that was already good, right? Whereas now we're starting to think about how do we bring data together so that we have information at the for the financing decisions that we can use around.
Yeah, and the other beauty, if I'll just add very briefly, is that with the capacity of AI techniques to operate on previous data, then we're not just looking at the information related to our single project. We can learn from other projects, and we can make more appropriate decisions at much earlier stages.
Yeah, and the Construction Innovation Hub has brought out a document on value, which I think is quite useful in terms of thinking about some of these issues. Yeah, I mean, I guess our challenge at the moment is knowing what whole life costs look like, right? Yeah. Especially in a world where the world is changing quite rapidly, and so sort of you know, the more that we can use data to address those things, the better, whilst recognizing that the future is uncertain. So I think it's a very interesting kind of question. Jon, do you want to come back in on this question about whole life costs and financing decisions and the use of data sort of at the early stage of a project?
Again, I mean, I think when I think back again to the larger clients that we're dealing with, if you sort of set a charter at the start of the program of, you know, what investments are we making, in other words, what are the inputs and then what are the outputs going to be, then I think you have the best chance for success, because and people will have a stake. You know, those with the gold, you know, make the rules, right? So I think there is going to be a little bit of a give and take, that you have organizations that are demanding certain inputs on the front end of all the stakeholders on the project, because they, the owners, will get the return on investment on the back end. I think you're always going to have differing views of people, you know, throughout the program. And, you know, our clients have spent a lot of time specifying contractually on the front end that even before you bid a project, keep in mind, these are the tools that are going to be used. This is the data that we're going to be asking for, and we, the owner, are going to, you know, benefit and own that data at the end of the day. So I think, you know, it goes back to one of the comments someone made, that, you know, private industry and profit-making businesses are setting the rules, and I think that's just at least what I've seen for the most part, that the only way for it to be effective, if you have sort of the heavy hand of the owner. But and by the way, when that does happen, you do get quite a wonderful product, especially if you have everybody that's bought into that process, genuinely speaking. And you see that from pre-qualified and repeat contractors and repeat architects that work quite a bit. You know, I keep picking on healthcare, but you're seeing that these are truly serial builders that have a repeatable process and are looking for repeatable outcomes, and everybody in that ecosystem, you know, stands to benefit and get stronger together. I don't know any other way to get that done other than the way that I've seen it over the last maybe, you know, five years. It's been successful.
So we're in the last 5 minutes of this panel session, and, you know, I think we've had a great discussion, but I just want to give each of you an opportunity just to make a closing comment, a quick closing comment, and then we'll come to close the session. And I suggest that we do it in reverse order. So Mark, we go to you first, Jon, Annabelle, and then Chimay, and then I'll just say a few words about the next session.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me onto it. I have genuinely learned so much from the fellow panelists. I think the thing that I would want to leave us with here is the thought that the essential promise of the information age, that the thing that will actually unlock the value in all of what we're talking about here, is making better decisions faster and cheaper. I think that's the essence of it all. Because we like to talk about technology, and we kind of then get into talking a little bit more about information. But you know, if you boil it down to what is the thing that releases the value, I think it is to do with making better decisions based on better analysis of better data. And therefore, we should do all of this stuff that we're talking about with a purpose in mind. You know, it should be driven by purpose, which I think is about driving better outcomes. And the route to unlocking the value, I think, is making better decisions based on better analysis of better data. So that would be my summation.
Thanks.
Yeah, so Mark, I'll build on what you're saying about the better data and better decisions. It's exciting for us, and for me especially now with Trimble over the last 3 years, is even if you take an example of, the GPS systems that they have to control, the excavating machines and the dozers, et cetera, on projects, and you might say, what does an owner really care about the amount of dirt that's been moved today? Well, they might care that X amount of dirt was moved, and maybe that costs $50,000 today. That's eventually going to work up its way into the spreadsheet. So if we could have all these different levels and types of data from all these various systems and various robots that are out there that are monitoring the field, the visualization capabilities, the laser scanning, and all that coming in so that you have all this data to make informed decisions, you are absolutely going to have better outcomes and better forecast capabilities. As you look down, it's that forward-looking, through the windshield, as opposed to tracking, which is really rear view mirror, Excel spreadsheet back in the day type of tracking information. So, we refer to it as the connected construction of how do we bring all these data sets together. So, obviously we're starting first within the ecosystem of all the data that we can control as a vendor. But then I think where it's going to lead to is having industry, whether it's adopting standards or working more closely together to be able to say, let's have all this data in, let's turn that data warehouse into a data lake so we can make those better decisions. That's the exciting future, I think, that's going to be really neat to watch.
So I want to join my my co-panelists to say, thank you, Jennifer, for putting us together, and I've learned a lot by listening to the panelists myself. I think this vision that Jon mentioned of connected construction is really a compelling vision, and I think that what I'd like to finish with is the following. Connected construction is going to create new kinds of value. And if history is any guide, the industry structure is not going to stay the same. There will be opportunities for small and medium enterprises to see how that value can get delivered, and then there will be demand flocking to that. When that happens, bigger companies are going to want to come into the fray. And so I think what I'd like to leave the audience with is that when new ways of creating value becomes visible, it's very important to protect the ability for the innovators to benefit from this innovation as well. So to think about business models, to think about how easy will it be to imitate. These are fundamental strategic question that sometimes innovators don't quite think about at the right moment. And so I think it would be exciting to see how a connected construction is going to change the world of construction. And I think for sure platforms are going to play a role in that.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this. I've really enjoyed it and I've learned a lot, and we have had to deal with some really interesting and difficult questions. But I have the thought that we are not just passive observers of the digital delivery process. We should be active participants. We have the capacity to shape the future. We have the capacity to actually make demands on what we'd like to see. And we then have the capacity to help with the development of these technologies, particularly those of us on the research side, and partnering with industry to make sure we are addressing the right problems, we are not building castles in the air, and that we're actually developing proof of concept prototypes that help to deliver value. So there's a whole lot of collaborative thinking that needs to take place on this side of it as well.
Thanks, Chimay. That's a really great sort of note to end on in terms of the contribution that we can make as academics and as researchers, and working closely with industry. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending this session. And I'd like to thank in particular some of the Transforming Construction Network team that I know are behind the scenes on this, and maybe also just to flag that that there's a research program, a core research program in that's been beginning to look at business models, and there's actually also another digest that we've written around business models, but that's an active bit of research that's going on, you know, picking up on some of Annabelle's comments. So we hope that you've found the presentations and this discussion useful and interesting. If you have any other questions, please contact directly the network team. The recording of this webinar with the slides will be shared by email after the event. The next session, how will we create resilient supply chains, will start at 3 o'clock. So you have a 15-minute break before the next session, and it finishes at 4:50. So the link to access this session can be found in the chat and in the email. So thank you very much, everybody. And that's the end of this session. Thank you.